Good morning in the UK and good evening in Australia. My name is Joanne Holland and I'm the Executive Director of the Australia-UK Chamber of Commerce. We connect Australian and UK businesses and have played a key role on behalf of our members in the negotiations in the FTA agreement through our Trade Policy Committee. Many of you will know that on the 16th of December 2021, a trade agreement was reached between Australia and the UK. This is the first trade agreement that the UK has entered into since Brexit. Australia has 16 free trade agreements, and this agreement was the fastest it has ever completed. This agreement also paves the way for the UK to trade with Asia through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the CTPPP. There are many elements to this free trade agreement, ranging from zero tariffs on goods traded between the countries to movement of people, innovation and investment between the two countries. It's a very exciting time for both countries. The agreement further strengthens the special relationship between our two countries. Today is the first of a series the Chamber will be undertaking. In this session, we're discussing the impact of the rules of origin arising out of the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement, with insights and key learnings to be shared by representatives from both the UK Department of International Trade and HM Revenue and Customs. Rules of origin stipulate how much of a product must originate in the UK to qualify for the lower tariff agreed in this deal when exporting to Australia and vice versa. The deal includes flexible rules of origin with minimised paperwork so businesses can take advantage of the zero tariffs. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. They have a wealth of knowledge and experience in the rules of origin. In no particular order today, we have Saloni Malhotra, Lead Trade Negotiator, Department of International Trade. Saloni leads the UK Rules of Origin policy and is the chapter lead for the UK-Australia Rules of Origin FTA negotiations. She's worked across several roles in the Department for International Trade, including the Chief Negotiations Team for the UK-US negotiations and setting up the UK's trade remedies regime. Josh Lambert, Senior Policy Advisor, Department of International Trade. He's the second chair for the UK-Australia FTA Rules of Origin negotiations, and he's previously worked on UK Rules of Origin FTA negotiations with New Zealand and Japan. Carmel Galvin, Senior Policy Advisor, Department of International Trade, and a member of the UK-Australia FTA Rules of Origin negotiation team. She also works on Rules of Origin FTA negotiations with New Zealand and previously worked at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Steve Lamprell, Operational Policy Lead, HM Revenue and Customs. Steve leads Operational Policy on Origin, Trade Defence and Agricultural Duties in the HM Revenue and Customs. He is a member of the UK-Australia Rules of Origin negotiation team and works on the implementation and operation of the UK's other trade agreements. And Peter Campbell, Policy Advisor, HM Revenue and Customs, and a member of the UK-Australia FTA Rules of Origin negotiation team. He also works on the UK's Rest of the World Origin Procedures FTA negotiations. I'd like to welcome our guest speakers today to speak on the Rules of Origin. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. Is it over to me then?
Yes, over to you, Saloni.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening if you're dialing in from Australia. Very great to see so many participants on the line. So as Joanne said, we are the team that negotiated the Rules of Origin chapter in the Australia FTA, including we also have colleagues on the line from DEFRA, which is the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and also colleagues from BEIS, who are the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and also colleagues from HMRC. I think I don't need to spell out the abbreviation. Everyone should be familiar with HMRC. But just to sort of outline that this was the actual team that negotiated the FTA. So we worked very, very closely with these other departments. So the deal was signed on the 16th of December and will come into effect once it's ratified. It was our first from scratch FTA. So the UK has obviously also rolled over its agreements that it was party to as part of the EU. So what we call it sort of our continuity program. But this was the first sort of UK template FTA, first from scratch FTA. We consulted businesses and interested parties at all stages of the negotiations, and the result is a trade deal that we think is tailored to the UK and the Australian economies. We started this process off with the public consultation in 2018, and have been engaging with businesses throughout the process. We hope that this engagement with businesses means that the rules of origin that we've agreed in the agreement work for most of our supply chains, both existing and future. It was really a negotiation between two like-minded countries. I think the ambition on both sides was to allow our businesses to trade and invest more freely in our two countries, and set new global standards, create opportunities for British and Australian businesses to collaborate on shared challenges. It's expected to increase trade with Australia by 53% and boost the UK economy by 2.3 billion. I'll hand over to my colleague shortly to take you through the details of the rules of origin chapter, but I just wanted to make a small disclaimer that we were expecting sort of a mixed audience in terms of sort of experience of utilizing rules of origin and free trade agreements. So we'll talk a bit about the basics of rules of origin before going into the specifics of the UK-Australia deal, because we weren't sure how familiar everyone sort of is with rules of origin on the call. But obviously, if you've already been trading under an FTA, for example, the UK-EU FTA, it's likely that you will already be familiar with some of the basic concepts that my team will talk about. So apologies in advance, but hopefully the UK-Australia specific details will still be of interest to you, because many things are different in this agreement. We've tried to make processes as easy as possible, sort of compared to maybe other global agreements that exist. So without further ado, I'll hand over to, I believe it's Carmel going first.
Yep, thanks, Saloni. Millie, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So yeah, as Saloni said, we're going to look a little bit at the basics. So to start off with, what are rules of origin? They are the means by which we determine goods originate from where they originate from. It's not about where they've been shipped from or shipped through. It's about where they've been deemed to be produced or manufactured. So in other words, we're looking at the economic nationality of the good. So in an FTA, we agree preferential tariffs. And to access those preferential tariffs, you have to look at the rules of origin behind. They're about how we know your good qualifies for the preferential tariffs in the FTA. They have to originate from the two parties in the agreement, such as, in this case, the UK and Australia. You don't have to use rules of origin. They are optional, but in that sense, you can't then use the preferential tariffs. So to have those preferential tariffs and to access the lower tariffs that we've agreed, you must use rules of origin. Because of this, we've had to agree rules that have been balanced between ensuring businesses can actually use the preferential tariffs. So they are reflecting UK and Australian industry practices and supply chains, but they also have to protect against circumvention. So protecting British and Australian industries by ensuring that only goods genuinely made in Britain and Australia can use the preferential tariffs. And with that, I'll go over to the next slide, please, Millie. Thanks. So this is what is in the chapter for rules of origin in the Australia-UK deal. We've got product-specific rules, general provisions, and origin procedures. As I said, when you are using the preferential tariff, so if you've decided that you want to use the preferential tariffs in the agreement, you then need to make sure your good meets the rule of origin that's set out in the FTA. So what should you do first? You should first look at the product-specific rule, otherwise known as the PSR. And this is just a list of all the specific rules for every good in a very long table by HS code. And you need to find the specific rule for your good. Then you need to look at the general provisions. So this is just what it says on the tin. It's textual articles which define the overall general overarching rules in the agreement. Here there are quite relevant things that have a broad range, and we're going to talk you through some examples of them later. So they might have things that are relevant to your good. And finally, you've got origin procedures. This is, again, as it says on the tin, it sets out the origin procedure, so the administrative side of rules of origin. So when you're looking, if you've looked at the PSR and you've looked at the general provisions and you know that your good meets the rules of origin, then you need to look at how you can prove that. So it's about how traders claim and prove origin and how customs authorities verify origin. And here I've also put the link to the chapter text. You can just Google it, search UK Australia FTA, find the chapter text, and it's chapter 4, which is rules of origin. And just to note that PSRs is in a separate annex to the chapter. It's all there on one page when you look at the gov.uk page, but just so you know, it's a separate annex. And I will take the next slide, please, Millie. Thank you. So firstly, we're going to look at the PSRs, the product-specific rules. And as I said, this is the first thing that you should do when you decide you want to access the preferential tariffs, because you need to know that your good is meeting the rule of origin before you can proceed. And there are two broad types of product-specific rules. There's your change in tariff classification, which is what we're looking at here. And there's your RBC rule, which we'll look at next. And the change in classification rule looks at how the classification changes. So it looks at the HS code and the different headings and how they change confers origin. So it's talking about any non-originating content in your good has to have undergone the transformation specified by your good in that line of the rule. So on this slide, we're looking at chapter 21 because it has a good example of all the different rules. It showcases all our different CTC rules here. Chapter 21 is miscellaneous edible preparations, and this is a direct screenshot from the actual FTA, which you can find on gov.uk. And I'm just going to say that when you do look at this text as well, at the beginning of the table of the PSRs, it does give you a definition of all of the different rules for the change in tariff classification one. So if you don't catch everything I say, it is there as well. So first, I'm going to look at the chapter and the change in chapter rule. So as your chapter, of course, is your first 2 digits in the code. So in this case, chapter 21. And your change in chapter rule, or your CC rule for short, is when all non-originating materials used in the production of the good have undergone a change in tariff classification at the 2-digit level. So the minimal change required is that your chapter changes. So those first 2 digits have to change for different chapters. So in this case, you've got 2102.10, 2102.20, and 2102.30. They all have a CC rule, a chapter change rule. So all ingredients that go into those have to come from outside the chapter. You cannot use active yeast in making inactive yeast and then export it. So you can't import active yeast, put it into inactive yeast, and then export it because there's no change in chapter. You will not meet the rule of origin, and therefore you will not be able to access the preferential tariff. Then I'm going to look now at the tariff heading rule. So that's looking at the next 2 digits, so your 3rd and your 4th rule. The next subgroup under your chapter is your tariff heading. And this rule is when all non-originating good materials used in the production of the good have undergone a change in classification at the 4-digit level. So it's just those next 2 digits have to change at a minimum. It can come from outside the chapter, but just at a minimum, the tariff heading has to change. So in this example, you could take something from 2102 or 2104 and put it into 2103.10, 20, or 30, and that would be fine because if you've imported those goods, then put them into soy sauce, tomato ketchup, or mustard flour, they have had that minimum change of the tariff heading change, and then you can export them as the finished product to Australia or the UK, depending on where you are. Or again, that's just the minimum change. You can do it from outside the chapter as well. In this example, I've given prepared tomatoes, which is 2102, and to 2103, and that's tomato ketchup. And finally, there's your tariff subheading. So that looks at the final 2 digits of the 6-digit code. In this case, I put the example of 2104.10. It's those 2 digits at the end, 10. And here we're looking at the change in tariff subheading. So your non-originating material that's used in the production of your good has to come from a different tariff subheading. So it's a change at the 6-digit level. And again, it can come from a different chapter, a different chapter or a different tariff heading, but at a minimum, it has to come from a different tariff subheading. So example, you could, if you wanted to use soups and broths, import those, put them into a homogenized composite food preparation, and then export that. And that would meet the change in tariff subheading. But another example from outside the chapter, you could import chicken cuts 20020713, put them into chicken soup 210410, and export that, and that would also meet the rule. And that, in summary, is what all the CTC rules are, the change in tariff classification. So you're looking at the minimum change required in the good from an ingredient is imported to then when it is exported. It has to have a change at the different levels. And now I'm going to pass over to Josh for the next slide, please, Millie.
Thanks very much, Carmel. So, along with the change in tariff classification rules, another method of establishing origin is via a regional value content, or an RVC method. So this basically calculates how much of the goods originating and non-originating materials make up the value of that good. So therefore, its sufficient value comes from originating content, according to the agreed RVC PSR, then the whole good will be considered as originating. The actual method for calculating RVC is located in the general provision section of the text. However, the PSR annex contains the specific rule for the RVC itself. The vast majority of references to RVC in the PSR annex will be covered by an RVC 40 rule, which basically means that 40% of the goods originating, 40% of the goods value is required to be originating to meet originating status. There are some variations to this. So you might see rules such as RVC 25 for finished cars. And again, this basically means that 25% of the car's value must come from originating materials in order to meet originating status. So I'll give it a couple of seconds just to sort of let all of that information sink in as I'm aware that there's quite a lot being thrown at you today. Okay, so how do we calculate an RVC? So ourselves and our Australian counterparts, we really wanted to provide traders with simple methods of calculation, whilst also offering flexibility in approaches. Just bear with me 2 seconds. I'm seeing a message that there's a slight echo. Is that okay for everyone, or is that still there?
I can hear you okay, Josh, so I would say just continue.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so how do we calculate it? So we're looking for flexibility in approaches as well. And therefore, we provided either the build-up method or the build-down method. The build-up method, so this looks to calculate minimum domestic or originating content required to meet origin, whereas build-down calculates the maximum non-originating content allowed to meet origin. Along with RVCs and CTC rules as well, there are also different applications of PSRs that you might come across in the FTA. An important one of these is specific processing rules, which, as the name suggests, enables specific processes to confer originating status. An example of this would be a chemical processing rule. So this would enable mixing and blending, amongst other things, of chemicals. However, these are all explained in further detail in the PSR annex for the chapters covered. And then finally, just for a bit of clarity, the inclusion of OR in the PSRs, as shown on the screen there, quite simply means that either method can be used to achieve origin. You don't have to achieve both. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so we thought it might be quite useful just to see a couple of the PSRs in the agreement in action. So before the webinar today, we received some interesting questions. The first of which relates to the application of FTA's rules in certain sectors, in this case for cosmetics. So in my example on the screen here, we've got a hypothetical shampoo producer, and they're looking to incorporate imported non-originating essential oils, in this case peppermint essential oils, into their shampoo, whilst also wanting to trade under preferential tariff rates. So looking at the CTH aspect of the PSR for shampoo, this means that it can be made using non-originating materials from any heading other than the heading the shampoo is classified in, which, as you can see on screen, is 3305. So the trade would locate the peppermint essential oils on the harmonized system and see that whilst they're also classified in chapter 33, they fall under the heading 3301, which of course is a different heading to 3305. And therefore, the non-originating essential oils would be considered originating when incorporated into the shampoo product, which could then be traded under preference, with the caveat that all the other goods imported into the shampoo also follow this CTH rule. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks very much. Oh, there should be another one just before that. I don't know, we just skip the RBC one there. Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, so here is an RBC example. So in this example, my hypothetical trader is interested in electronic manufacturing. And just for a bit of clarity here, I've used some completely made up figures just to keep things really simple in the example. So yeah, don't be confused if any of these look out of place against real world figures. So as with the previous example, the trader would locate the PSR, in this case for electronic circuit amplifiers, and find that it is RBC 40 or CCSH. So they know that at least 40% of their goods value needs to come from originating materials. The overall value of the good in this scenario is £1.30, and 50p worth of that comes from originating materials, which, using the build-up calculation method, the trader identifies as being 38% worth of the value, so 38% originating, and therefore this amplifier would not meet origin, which is currently set at RBC 40 or 40% originating. Of course, again, this is super simple. So there might be a lot of other more challenging values that are incorporated into this, but just keep things reasonably understandable. Could I have the next slide, please? Perfect. So this is the general provisions section of the text. And again, I'll give you a couple of seconds just to familiarize yourself with the slide on the screen. Cool. So, general provisions section of the RU chapter consists of 17 articles that are set out, or that do set out, sorry, the overarching principles of acquiring originating status and how origin should be determined in specific circumstances. So, in other words, if the PSRs are the lead singer in the rules of origin band, the general provisions are more of a rhythm guitarist that complement the other sections and piece everything together. I've highlighted a few articles there on the screen that hopefully are of some interest, which cover the treatment of packaging and RU conditions for goods in transit. I will flag that the articles within our UK Australian general provisions text are all standard clauses across FTAs. And of course, there's more information on all of these within the text itself. Of course, happy to take any specific questions around general provisions articles in the Q&A at the end. One other important thing to flag on general provisions is that we've not included a insufficient processing article. Again, this is for ease of use for the agreement of traders. So therefore, as long as traders meet the product-specific rules as set out in the PSR annex, they will qualify for reduced tariffs. And we've also found that this ensures that the traders who specialize in high-value approaches to simple processes will again also benefit from the agreement itself. I think I'm now handing over to HMRC for the next slides. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that, Josh. I'm going to talk about origin procedures. First of all, I'll just talk about the proofs of origin that importers are able to rely on. So for the UK-Australia agreement, importers effectively have two choices. They're able to rely on a self-issued origin declaration. in this agreement, it's called a declaration of origin, but it means the same thing. It's an origin declaration or statement on origin. Can I just ask Millie if you move on to the next slide, if that's possible? Thank you. That's great. So the importer is allowed to claim on the basis of a declaration of origin or on importer's knowledge. I think most of you who have claimed under preference before should be aware of a declaration of origin. It's the same principle as what's used in the UK EU TCA agreement and also in UK Japan. So effectively, the declaration needs to have been completed by an exporter or a producer and then handed to the importer at the time that the claim is made. The declaration needs to meet the minimum data requirements, and it needs to be attached to an invoice or other commercial document. I think one facilitation to mention for this agreement is that the UK has agreed that it doesn't matter where the data elements are contained, as long as they're attached to the bundle of documents. So what this means is that you could potentially have, if your invoice is already going to contain certain elements, I guess some of the changing elements like the date or the name of the importer, the date of shipment, etc., then you can attach that to the origin declaration, which might contain the rest of the elements, such as the description of the good and the name of the exporter. So if you're shipping the same good all the time, those elements I guess are going to be static. So you could simply attach that to the invoice, and that's going to save, I think, quite a lot of time. And then the other option for claiming preference is under importer's knowledge, which is the same type of facilitation that was agreed with the EU. And I think we're really expecting importer's knowledge to be the primary source of proof in this agreement. So a quick sort of explanation of what importer's knowledge is. This is where the importer claims on the basis of their own knowledge that the good is originating. There's no requirement to complete a declaration of origin. Instead, the importer simply states that they're claiming under importer's knowledge, but they must have all of the necessary documentation and evidence to prove origin at the time that the claim is made, and be able to share and demonstrate that with, if requested by the customs authority. The evidence which the importer is likely to be relying on is more often than not going to have been provided by the exporter, but the exporter is not under any obligation to assist with that request for preference. So I think importer's knowledge is perhaps the biggest example of that major facilitation that's reducing the administrative burden, because the exporter is almost sort of not taking that active role any longer in the claim for preference, and the importer, if they have that knowledge, is able to just claim without having to complete that declaration. And if you can move on to the next slide, please, Millie. Thank you. So this slide is just covering the waiver, the exemptions of the origin declaration. I mean, first thing is that, of course, if you're claiming under importer's knowledge, then there's a de facto waiver because you're not having to complete that origin declaration. But then if the good doesn't exceed £1,000 in customs value, and that's applicable for any good, then no origin declaration is required. I think just to caveat, traders still have to ensure that the good complies with the requirements provided in the chapter, and that if requested, would be able to demonstrate that, because while the text is stating that the customs authority will grant a claim for preference under £1,000, it's only so long as there's no doubt in the veracity of the claim. And I think just to mention as well that this waiver limit of £1,000 is a UK a HMRC set limit. I'm not entirely sure what that value will be for UK goods imported into Australia. So I think it's worth checking with Australian Customs Authority. I think my understanding is that in other agreements, Australia has set that at $1,000 Australian dollars. So I guess around £600. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And then just finally to touch on record keeping. again, if you're claiming under importer's knowledge or on the basis of a declaration of origin, there's still a minimum of 4 years to keep documentation, and that documentation is relating to any type of any document or evidence that you're relying on for the importation. And the importance of that documentation and to keep the records is, and I think mainly for verification purposes. So if the customs authority, as a first port of call, if the customs authority of the importing party is contacting the importer, and that importer is expected to have all that documentation to hand if necessary. And then further, if the claim has been based on a declaration of origin, the exporter or producer would be expected to have their evidence and a copy of that declaration to assist the importing authority. And then in some cases, in quite rare cases, if the importing authority is still not able to make that determination, then there might be a request for a site visit, and that would go to the exporter or producer. And that's it. I'm going to hand over to Carmel now.
Thanks, Peter. I was just trying to get my video started. There we go. Can we have the next slide, please, Millie? Great. So we just ran through a lot of information there. Hopefully familiar to most of you. If not, hopefully you were able to take it in. But just wanted to summarize a few things. So this is looking at how we actually use the lower tariff that we've agreed in the FTA. So how do you access the preferential tariff? So once you've chosen that, like we said, you've got to check that you meet the rules of origin. So that's checking the PSR, checking the GP text, then looking at the paperwork to prove you meet the rules of origin. So the things that Peter just outlined there. There are two tools that businesses can use. There's the UK business exporting to Australia, which is check how to export goods, check that link there. And then also the Australian businesses exporting to the UK, trade with the UK, and that link there. And next slide, please, Millie. So here's an example of trade with the UK. You first type in where you're exporting from. So in this case, I put Australia. Then I found a good. Here I just randomly picked lip makeup preparations, lipstick. And then you've got trade status, tariff taxes, rules of origin, and product specific regulations all listed there. To note, this is not yet updated for Australia because it hasn't come into force, but when it does, this will be updated, and so we'll check. And finally, I will hand over to Josh and Peter for the next slide, please, Millie.
Thanks, Carmel. So we just thought it'd be useful to give a summary and an overview of what we believe. A quick summary and an overview of the agreement and the benefits that we believe it brings. So we believe that we provide significant benefits for traders in both parties, which can be broadly placed into two categories: flexible and facilitative rules of origin, and also minimized admin requirements. We've looked to develop a route that's both modern and trade facilitative. An example of this would be the inclusion of an RBC25 for finished cars, the most liberal of its kind for this good, which will assist in transitions towards trade in eco-friendly vehicles. As mentioned, we've also looked to facilitate trade by removing insufficient transformation requirements in order to simplify the rules of origin. Also, our rules are such that many supply chains and industry practices will still be able to continue to use their current form and current supply chains, while still accessing preferential rates. However, there are also subsequent opportunities to utilise new suppliers and still export under the FTA. This being said, whilst facilitative, we've also considered and provided protections against unreasonable practices from conferring originating status for sensitive sectors. And I'll hand back to Peter to summarise for minimised admin requirements.
Yep, thanks, Josh. I think one thing to note on the origin procedure section for UK Australia is I think the requirements are pretty straightforward, but they reflect as best as possible other modern FTAs, including the EU, TCA and Japan, I think where possible, both parties have been able to work together to increase the facilitations and reduce, where possible, any admin burden and doing away with any unnecessary requirements. I think the main, as touched on earlier, importers' knowledge is perhaps the biggest example of that, removing the obligation for the importer to seek a statement on origin from their exporter or producer every time that they claim preference. And thereby that's reducing not just the burden for the importer, but also the burden on the exporter. And as far as I'm aware, I think this is the first FTA that Australia has agreed to importers' knowledge provisions. So I think this is quite a big step for Australia as well. But then for the UK, it's just building on the existing agreements which we've reached with the EU and Japan. And then even when the importer does rely on a declaration of origin instead of importer's knowledge, the requirements for the exporter are fairly easy to understand. The minimum data elements are, well, as minimum as they can be. And the declaration is self-issued, so traders are not having to rely on a competent authority issued stamp certificate. And then again, simple build up and build down calculation methods for determining originating status by regional value content are found in the agreement. And that's it. Fairly simple requirements, as simple as we can make them, and hopefully very, very easy to understand.
Thank you. Thank you to our speakers. We're going to go into Q&A now, and I'd like to introduce two other government representatives who will be joining for the Q&A. Melanie Sayers. Melanie's a Senior Policy Advisor for the Rules of Origin in Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. She's representing the UK in manufactured good negotiations with Australia, and she's worked across multiple UK trade negotiations, including the EU, US, Turkey and India. And we also have Tom Dufty. Tom is a Policy Advisor for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he's worked with DEFRA and involved in several negotiations, including the UK-Australia FTA and continuity trade agreements. So thank you for joining us. And so questions can be directed to Melanie and Tom during the Q&A session. So I'll open up the Q&A session now. We have 4 Q&As, and the first one I've got here is from James, and he says, I've got products made in the EU, rules of origin in PT, I guess that's Portugal, delivered to the UK with no tariff. If I distribute to Australia, will there be a tariff?
Hi there, it's Melanie here. Can you hear me? Apologies, my video won't start for some reason. Let's see if I can get that to... No, it's not coming on, but I will just move on to the question. Thanks, James. So I don't know exactly what PT refers to, but in general, so we don't have accumulation with the EU under the UK-Australia agreement. So we would need a little bit more information about what exactly happens with the product there and what the HS code is and what manufacturing does take place, if any, in the UK. If nothing happens to the product when it comes over here, then in fact, no, you wouldn't then be able to move the goods with preferential access and really just distribute it to Australia. But happy to follow up with, if you have like further details on that, we're very happy to take questions like later on, if you maybe get in contact with Joanne. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to say that if there are any questions that the panel is not able to answer directly now, we will take them and we will get back to you with the answers to the questions. I have another question now from Alessandro. Could you clarify the difference between the FTA's value of good and the ex-works price for the good? Ex-works is the value used in continuity deals and the TCA.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think similar to Mel, my video is also having some challenges right now, so I'll just continue like this. So in our initial bilateral FTAs, we've looked to move away from the use of Incoterms, which are commonly used in EU agreements. So therefore, where you would normally see an ex-works price utilised in an EU agreement, we've used our own definition of value of the goods, as is outlined in the general provisions text, the definition section of that text, that is. So that's the primary reason behind that, but it still works very much in a similar format.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. So from Kylie, we're a textile business that imports some textiles from Australia and New Zealand. We also have a client base in Australia where we have to cut and export these fabrics back to Australia. So they're currently being charged duty both when importing and exporting. Would the FTA cover our products being exported back to Australia regardless of whether they were Australian or New Zealand origin?
Happy to take that. Thanks, Kylie. Again, I think really we would need to know the exact HS code of your product, but in general, the rules between UK and Australia for textiles are very, what we would think is quite liberal, and trying to capture as many processes as possible. So I think, you know, it sounds likely that you would be able to use that, but we would need to know a little bit more detail around those HS codes and the product itself.
Thank you. Another question just on the timelines for ratification of the free trade agreement.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Oh, my voice went funny there. Happy to come in on that. And I think there's a few other questions in the chat that this might answer as well. So on ratification, we don't know the exact date of entry into force, as there's lots of processes on our side and the Australia side that have to occur before. On our side, we anticipate there being a period of several months before the agreement is formally laid before Parliament for scrutiny under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, which is also known as CRAG. This allows time for the Trade and Agriculture Commission to prepare its advice to inform drafting of the report, and the government will produce under Section 42 of the Agriculture Act 2020. The government's report, as well as the tax independent advice, will then be laid before Parliament. This also ensures that there is time for the International Trade Committee and the International Agreements Committee to produce a report should they so wish. We have also identified that some legislative changes will be required to implement the FTA, and any legislative changes will be scrutinised and passed by Parliament in the usual way. So once all of those processes of scrutiny are done, the deal will be ratified and we pass the necessary primary and secondary legislation. Australia will need to do what they need to do on their side as well. So there's quite a few steps that need to be taken for it to come into effect. And I just thought I'd answer as well. There was a question, how long will we feel until we feel the kind of the benefits from it? And I think that in a way partly answers it. But the other answer is if you look in the impact assessment that's on gov.uk that we published, there you will see the methodology for the research, all of the analysis that's gone into this. And there hopefully will be an answer to your question, but I'm happy to take it away for you if you would like to. I can't remember who exactly asked the question in the chat.
Thank you. Is it up to the exporter and the importer to determine who's responsible for self-certification? Does it matter?
Yeah, I can answer this question. It's purely, so there's a choice. So the importer has a choice whether to use importer's knowledge or to rely on a declaration. If they're relying on a declaration of origin, then it's up to, I guess, that business relationship that they have with the exporter or producer. There's no obligation on the exporter's part to agree to completing a declaration or the producer. So it's just it's purely the exporter's choice whether to do it or not. And if they do it, then there is an obligation placed on the exporter, such as record keeping, etc. So yeah, it's completely up to the business relationship that the importer has.
Thank you. Is the 75,000 threshold for the Australian GST registration of your annual business gross income still in place? As if trade is encouraged, will this be lifted?
I don't think that question is for us to answer. I'm just
We can take that away and talk to the Australians about that.
Yeah. Thanks.
I import into the UK clothing and, for example, jeans, t-shirts, chinos, etc., from China, Turkey, and Portugal, and none of these goods are valued above $100. Would I be eligible to take advantage of the FTA?
Hi. So I suppose again, I'm sorry, it sounds like a broken record. It really depends on what you would do to them in the UK, if anything. So again, you know, very happy to discuss that in a bit more detail about what those processes are, if any. If you're doing some manufacturing in the UK, as long as it goes beyond what you would class as sufficient transformation, then absolutely yes.
Joe, could I just jump in there as well? I think Michael also asked the question about, does China, Turkey, or Portugal have an FTA with Australia? China does. I don't know what's in it, so I would recommend you going on their website to look. And Turkey and Portugal, I believe not, but again, it should all be on their website for you to check there.
Thank you. What are the implications for preferential tariffs if an exporter doesn't meet the minimum RVC threshold, but the non-originating materials come from a country that also has an FTA with Australia, e.g. UK manufacturer imports from country X, which also has an FTA with Australia, continues manufacturing, then sells finished goods to Australia?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I can take that one. So essentially, I think that question is looking there at diagonal accumulation. So in our UK-Australian FTA, we haven't got diagonal accumulation from entry into force. It's something that we have means to discuss further through our working group on rules of origin, customs and trade facilitation. So essentially, at the minute in our FTA, we have standard bilateral accumulation. So goods imported into the UK from a mutual non-party would not automatically be given originating status when subsequently traded to Australia. That is the rule from the offset. However, as I mentioned, there are means to further discuss this in future with our Australian counterparts. And in addition to that, we'd also be having discussions there on potential diagonal accumulation with LDC countries. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a thank you for the presentations from Katrina. What are the rules of origin for meat under the deal?
So I can come in on this. So for both Chapter 2, just meat and processed meat of Chapter 16, the rule is chapter change. So this is different, Katrina, from what's in the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. What this essentially means is that you can chapter change from Chapter 1 into Chapter 2, so essentially slaughter conferring origin. And then for Chapter 16 products, it is allowing the use of imported Chapter 2 meats as well in those products. It is worth saying, however, that you still do need to consider any other domestic legislation, such as animal welfare around live animal transport in this. And I guess a chapter change in this respect is much more typical of a rest of the world style agreement.
Thank you. This is a question of economics, I guess. A 2% increase in UK's GDP as a result of the FTA is forecasted. Over what time period is this forecast?
So I think this one falls to me. I'm not 100% sure because I haven't had a full read of the impact assessment, but I would suggest having a look at that on gov.uk. And if the answer's not there, get in touch through you, Joe, and I can speak to the analyst here to find the answer.
Right. Okay, thank you. We have a question on whether you could elaborate on accumulation and how this relates to the new FTA.
Yeah, I can take that one again. So I guess firstly it's important to know that forms of accumulation beyond standard bilateral accumulation are not commonly used in bilateral FTAs, and we've designed PSRs in this agreement that look to avoid the need for using accumulation as a means of accessing preferential rates. Just as a general, I guess, recap of what accumulation is for anyone who's unaware. So it's just a term used to describe a system that basically allows originating products of country A to be further processed or added to products originating in country B, just as if they had originated in country B in the first place. And this only works where both countries are operating with identical rules of origin, as would be the case in our UK-Australian FTA. There are other forms of accumulation as well. So you've got diagonal accumulation and extended accumulation. And as mentioned earlier, those currently aren't secured within this agreement. However, we do have further means to discuss diagonal accumulation with our Australian counterparts in future.
Oh, well, a follow-up to that is that full bilateral accumulation of both materials and processing?
Yes, correct.
On ratification, are the tariffs immediately removed?
So on this one, for most, I think the answer is yes, but there are some rules that are phased. So specifically in agri, I know there are phased tariffs. So it's over a period of, I believe, 15 years, some tariffs will be removed. So hopefully, yeah, the answer is yes and no to Hayden.
Okay. And our final question for today is, what do you foresee as a roadblock to the effective implementation of the new rules of origin?
You're on mute, I think.
Oh, really? Can people hear me?
Yeah, sorry, we couldn't hear you at the beginning.
Okay. So yeah, so the roadblock that we generally see with this is actually lack of awareness on the rules and lack of awareness that there's a trade deal in the first place. Now that we've got the new independent trade policy, we've got like this whole new thing that we can do, and people aren't necessarily going to be aware of the different options available to them. So using things like this webinar, using the policy explainers and all the general guidance that was published around agreement and signature, we hope that we've kind of increased awareness. But this, to answer another question, I believe will be available afterwards, this webinar, the recording, and we can give the slides as well to Joanne and the team to put like along with it. So again, you can access this all afterwards. So yeah, so hopefully we've got a few things in place there to increase awareness and make sure that everyone who wants to be able to use it can actually use the FTA.
Thank you. We got a little note from someone saying Dick Porter is our chairman of the Australian UK Chamber of Commerce, and yesterday he was awarded an AM. So we congratulate Dick on that honour. I want to thank the panellists today. It was absolutely excellent. If you'd like any more information, then please do email us on invitations@australiachamber.co.uk. We'd love you to join the chamber. We've got lots of very exciting events coming up, and our next webinar on procurement for government contracts, which is a great bonus, will be held on the 16th of February. So we'd love you to join us for that, and also please get in touch with us and join the chamber. So thank you again to our panellists. It was excellent. We can also follow up by responding to some of the questions we haven't been able to answer in full today. So please do get in touch with us. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.